Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome to Service Never Sleeps Book Talk series, where we feature and amplify authors in the racial justice space as an opportunity to learn from their important insights. Service Never Sleeps is a Black-led organization that empowers justice-minded individuals with the tools and posture to be effective allies and to advance equity within their spheres of influence. And these book talks serve as an opportunity for our larger SNS community to deepen their racial justice journeys through learning and action, both of which are critical to driving change. My name is Whitney Parnell. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the founder and CEO of Service Never Sleeps. Today, I'm a Black woman with brown skin. Today, I have on a, I'll say, hot peach silk shirt with a collar, a low collar, and actually no collar at all, sorry. And my hair is up in a puff that's pulled back. And I have on black earrings that in yellow and red say, "My melanin is dope." And the earrings are circular. And behind me is a white backdrop. So that's how I'm presenting visually. And I am so incredibly excited to be engaging my friend and published author, Natasha Hakimi Zapata, for our book talk today. So, welcome, Natasha.
Hi, Whitney. Thanks so much for having me.
It's such an honor to have you here to discuss your incredible book, Another World is Possible: Lessons for America from Around the Globe. I loved this book so much. I'm so excited to talk about it. But before we get into that, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Natasha? That's such an open-ended question and loaded question. So feel free to respond with what feels most important for you to lift up right now. Who is Natasha?
Well, so first of all, Whitney, thank you so much. You've known me a really long time. You've known a different Natasha or a younger Natasha, maybe just the seeds of the Natasha that I am today. So it's really wonderful to connect and to be here with you and with your audience and talk a little bit about my book, but also about issues that I think we both really care about, and I think probably a lot of people who are listening will care quite a lot about. And so, to introduce myself, I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for about 15 years now. I'm also a poet, a teacher, a translator. And lecturer. And in terms of my background, so moving a little bit from the professional to the personal, I am the daughter of undocumented immigrants from Mexico and Iran. I was born in the States and grew up partly in the States and partly in Mexico, from where I know you. And, I've spent a lot of my life in different countries and thinking a lot about how we can address certain issues that we are all impacted by and trying to learn from other places how they tackle similar issues. And so I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's really the my beat, as we would say in journalism, is kind of a solutions oriented journalism in which I'm thinking a lot about uh, problems around the world, political problems around the world, and then how we can solve them.
Thank you. I love that language, your beat, and I love that language, solution-driven journalism as well. So thank you for that. And I just learned something new about you being a poet. So just a reminder that there's always more to learn in relationship. And I just have to lift up, you touched on this a little bit, but this interview is so special because we met in high school when we both lived in Mexico City. And it's just really special to see where you are now and for core components of your personality to still be so present and prevalent. A funny story for the audience, just to be able to give an example behind that. I've always known Natasha to be a deeply kind person who's willing to help out however she can, so much so that in high school, I was putting on a benefit concert and needed an MC. So I was like, Natasha, would you be willing to MC this concert? And also, can you do it in English and Spanish? And she was like, never done it before, but sure. And I had that memory so strong for me because it is just such a great example about how you're always willing to be there and so deeply kind, which I've always admired about you.
Thank you, Whitney. What's funny about that story is that it also highlights, you and your work and how you've, since we were kids, have been doing the kind of work that really makes an impact and putting on a benefit concert when we were kids. I mean, that's something I wouldn't have even thought of to do. But you've always been so empowered and empowering. So it's again exciting to be here.
The honor is mutual, my friend, and I am so excited to talk about your book. And so I'm wondering, just to set up the audience, can you tell us what your book is about and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you held up the cover earlier, which I think almost matches your top.
Yes,
It's a very
intention.
pink, yeah, for those in the audience, it's a pink cover and in blue and orange with a bit of a globe on it in the background. It says "Another world is possible: lessons for America from around the world," and then it has my full byline. And so this book came out. This is my first nonfiction book. It came out with the New Press in 2025. The paperback and hardcover February 2025. The hard paperback is coming out in September. And essentially, this is a culmination of quite a few years worth of work, but even more years worth of thinking in terms of, being a journalist. And as I was saying earlier, living in a lot of different countries. I've had the privilege and the opportunity to live in many different countries, aside from Mexico, where you and I met. And throughout my time abroad, I have been working as a journalist and an editor, and commissioning and writing and reporting on issues that in the U.S. it really felt like we were taking one step forward and two steps backwards often. And at the same time, I was living in countries like Portugal and the UK and Argentina and a number of other places where I felt that some of these issues had either been closer or they were closer to being solved. I think a lot of these things are live and you have to continue to fight and not get too complacent. But also, they had tackled these issues that we share in a lot of really interesting, perhaps for the time, innovative, certain, oftentimes even radical ways that felt to me, and I think this is a big theme throughout my book, more humane than a lot of the ways that we have approached certain issues in the US. And so I'm sure I'll kind of delve into the different chapters in a moment. But to give you an idea of the personal side again, so there's always sort of a professional and a personal side, and I do put myself into the introduction of the book, and it was important to me that I did. I talked earlier about how I'm the daughter of undocumented immigrants, and I often talk about how my brothers and I have two younger brothers who we really were these little American dreams that my parents had. And we grew up with that idea that in the US there were so many things that were possible that just weren't possible in their native countries in Mexico and Iran. And um, as we got older, it started to feel a lot like that dream that they had was possibly more possible in some of the other countries I'd lived in. And a lot of that understanding was triggered by a health event, a health related issue related to my mom. So, Winnie, because we're friends, that I actually lost my mom earlier this year, and I haven't talked very much publicly yet about that, but she is in the introduction, and she is a huge part of why I believe in a lot of the things I believe in. And so this book starts with my mom calling me while I'm in grad school in Boston and telling me that she's going to have her right foot amputated. And her story didn't begin there, or her health problems didn't begin there, but many, many years before that, when she couldn't afford health insurance, she couldn't afford health care, she didn't have access to continuous health care throughout her life, and was unable to really, monitor what ultimately became life-threatening diabetes. She wasn't even diagnosed at the time that she was sent. She went to the hospital and had this health emergency. And at the time that she called me, I, of course, was concerned for her well-being, and so many of us have been there. So you know how, unfortunately, you will know how I felt, this dread of what was going to happen to my mom. How was she going to survive? But I immediately had another dread, which was, how are we going to afford the care that she's going to need moving forward? How are we going to afford the insulin she's going to need moving forward. And I knew because I'd lived in countries like the UK where I live now, I'm zooming in from London, that it didn't have to be that way. That there are countries, there are societies that have lifted some of these burdens off of people in their times of need, or in these kind of desperate moments in which, had this happened in the UK, I would be concerned for my mom, of course, but I wouldn't have had to even consider the question of how we were going to afford any of the care, because I have universal health care here, and then the world's first ever national health service, completely free at the point of delivery. And so those are the two main inspirations behind this book, the sense that we could do better in the US, because I had seen and experienced, and still to this day live with, sometimes better policies than I did when I lived in the US when I was growing up there, and that my family and communities still have to deal with. And the other part, which again is the more personal aspect, which I really do believe that politics are personal, and I couldn't start anywhere but my own experience with my family, and moved on from there to really think about how policies impact people, even people who, like my mom, don't necessarily know how policies impact her, or didn't know, um, didn't feel like policies were written for her, or certainly not by her or people like her. And yet every day was having to live with the impact of these policies, or policy failures often.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Natasha. And yeah, I've certainly been holding you in my heart over these months and appreciate you sharing. And I'm really moved by just how you took your personal experience to really provide all of us with this gift of knowledge for, no pun intended, what is possible. And thank you for just serving as that example of tying in policies and personal, because I feel like it's so easy, especially in this culture, to dehumanize everything. And then policy sort of just becomes this thing that's there that isn't grounded in its purpose, which is to ultimately impact people. So just really appreciating you sharing that tie-in for you. And I was certainly able to make tie-ins amidst many topics that you explored throughout this book. So thank you for providing that example for us all to read this book through that personal lens as well. That was very powerful.
Thanks, Whitney. And so I don't know, maybe I could go over a little bit what the different chapters are about, and talk a lot. So talk a little bit. I
I
won't
would
talk
love
too but just
that.
about how a lot of what I wanted to do, people ask me, who did you write this book for? Who were you,
Mm,
who did you want to read this book? And I often answered that in my mind, my sort of ideal reader was always still my mom. And this person who, didn't feel that policy was written for her or by her or people like her, and yet was impacted by it. And
mhm.
so I took that approach in a lot of, I went to 10 different countries and was looking at policies that I considered we could learn something from, both from their successes and their failures.
Mhm.
And really tried to take that approach. I haven't lived in a lot of these countries. I have lived in a couple of them, but I wanted to pass the microphone really to the people who have not just written these policies. I did get the chance to sit down with quite a few policymakers
Yeah,
and activists and union leaders, and
yeah.
um, but but especially I wanted to talk to people quite literally just on the street, and
Mhm.
understand how everyday citizens and residents were being impacted by these policies that I had read so much about and heard so much about. So I took an approach of sort of beginning of life to end of life, in this crib to crypt approach that
Mhm.
uh, many of you will have heard of, and started again at the beginning of life. And many of us now are born in hospitals, and healthcare is such an important issue. And so I started where I live in the UK, looking at their universal healthcare system, the first in the world, as I mentioned earlier, the National Health Service, and moved on to, family-friendly policies. This is something that we're really lacking in the US. We're one of the only wealthy countries in the world not to have any sort of state-backed paid parental leave, maternity leave, let alone, paternity, parental leave writ large. And I went to Norway, where so many of us have heard so much about how Scandinavian countries tackle these problems. And I didn't just want to go to Scandinavia. I wanted to show that there were a lot of different countries with very different backgrounds, different economies that were tackling issues that we share in very different ways, and having really great results. And so, but Norway, I couldn't resist going to Norway and Finland, which I'll talk about later, where they have about a year of paid parental leave for both parents to share. And one of the reasons I chose Norway as well was because 3 months of that is a non-transferable amount that's for co-parent or oftentimes dad. And that has had a really fascinating impact on how caregiving is shared throughout society and how parents are viewed as equal caregivers, not just in their homes, but also in the workplace and in broader society. And then I moved on to housing, and Singapore has this really fascinating public housing program in which about 80% of Singaporeans live in public and in high quality, mixed income, affordable public housing. And 90% are homeowners, thanks to this like very unique way that they've designed this program. Then you have, and they've essentially eradicated homelessness. I did talk about homelessness in the chapter, but it's compared to the situation we have in the U.S., it's not comparable. Finland, which did something quite radical at a time in which it had very few resources in the end of the sort of 70s, 80s, and actually decided to abolish private schools and put a significant amount of resources and attention into a universal public school system, and surprised everyone, even themselves, by beating, every OECD country's kids in these PISA exams, which the OECD does every few years. And to this day, Finland continues to sort of outperform students in a lot of other countries that don't have such an equitable start to their educational lives. And I think this is one of the things I was really interested in.
Sorry, can
Uh,
you clarify for us what OCD means?
OECD.
OECD? Yeah.
Of course. I'm going to look up the exact initial. So it's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So it's 38 countries around the world. These are usually like the wealthiest nations. And it's an organization where oftentimes there are a lot of studies that are done by the OECD, and there's a lot of cooperation across the 38 countries. Um, and so moving on to Portugal, where I also lived, I was really surprised to see that at the same time that in the US, we started this disastrous war on drugs that kind of continues this like very punitive criminal justice approach to drug addiction and drug use.
Mhm.
The Portugal decided to do something completely different and actually decriminalized all drug use, which moved it from a criminal justice issue, not the sale, the use, to from a criminal justice issue to a public health issue. And that change alone really opened up a huge range of possibilities about what kinds of services, what kinds of support you could offer people who did have any sort of problematic use issues. Um, this was also important, of course, because in the US we have high rates of incarceration, especially in BIPOC communities, linked to drug use. And so instead of spending expending all those lives and resources on keeping people imprisoned, Portugal decided to actually use those resources to help people when they needed it, if they wanted the help. There was never this, it wasn't forced. I moved on to Estonia, which took a really interesting internet as a human right approach to its public and private services. I focused on the public services. One of the things I found fascinating was this sort of citizen portal that they have in Estonia, where you can log on, and you'll see everything from, they have universal healthcare as well. Well, a lot of countries do. Um, from your health records to, you could renew your driver's license, you can get married, you can, all of the kind of public services that oftentimes in the US, still to this day, despite the fact that we have immense resources and we have, all of these big tech companies and all of this, we do not have streamlined online access to a lot of public services. And this actually results in what Megan Day from Jacobin Magazine calls austerity through bureaucracy, where it is so difficult oftentimes to access services that we have a right to, benefits that we have a right to, that there are a ton of uncollected benefits, a ton of, you know, hundreds of hours a year that Americans spend just trying to do literal physical paperwork still.
Hmm. Hmm.
Oftentimes spending money on services like, for example, to pay your taxes, when in Estonia it takes a few seconds to pay your taxes and just a couple of
Hmm.
clicks, it's completely free. Things like this that I found that this use of the internet, this use of digital services was really for the good of the people. And I really appreciated that. And then I went to Uruguay where they did something that hadn't been done before, which was to nearly entirely green their grid in under 10 years. And, despite the fact that it's not a country with heavy industry, it is a country that had far less resources than a lot of other nations that have been talking about renewable energy for quite a long time and yet it actually hadn't actually tested their ability to completely green their grid. And I saw how they essentially moved from having quite a lot of hydroelectric energy, but relied nearly for half of their electric needs or their electricity needs on fossil fuels to having wind and solar and some biomass and things like this. And now, um, during the period in which they transitioned to green energy, were able to actually really grow their economy and tackle poverty in ways that they weren't able to before because partially because they were spending so much money on importing fossil fuels. Costa Rica, I mean, this is something that a lot of us have a lot of anxiety about, is this mass biodiversity loss that we're experiencing, the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss that are intertwined are really concerning. They're existential questions. And I think Costa Rica, a country that has these incredible natural riches, has really found a way to codify protections of their natural resources in a way that understands that they need to be protected, but that the benefits of protecting those natural resources need to be felt by current generations of Costa Ricans, but also future generations of Costa Ricans. And then I ended in New Zealand, where they have a flat rate universal pension program, which isn't too dissimilar from our Social Security, except that because it's a flat rate non-contributory program, essentially means that everyone from the age of 65, if they meet a residency, a basic residency requirement, have access to the exact same amount um, of pension payments for the rest of their lives. And so it just ensures that at the minimum in old age, people can rely on a certain amount of income that can give them hopefully a dignified old age. So that's
Mm.
the very quick summary of a pretty long book.
I loved that summary, and it parallels so much just how I've used this book to go to people and be like, look at just the snapshot of each of the chapters, right? Like the table of contents and just the different countries and the policies. Even just on this page, you can see not what is just possible, but what is happening. And so I loved your breakdown of what you were spotlighting in each country. And as you were talking, Natasha, I was hearing so many themes. I was hearing about how everybody, the people, and the nation at large benefit from these policies. I was hearing about the various level of resources that these different countries had, and that the shared theme was, or shared value rather, was directing the resources that they had to center their particular priority. And I was hearing the importance of even narrative shifts to drive these policies and how that was so effective. And it kind of took me back to a moment that I was struck by when you were talking about your approach to this was how you centered narrative when it came to your research, from talking to folks who actually pursued some of these policies to the effects of these policies on folks in the country. And I'm just wondering, as someone who for a blip in time actually was interested in a journalism career before, hard pivoting to activism, I'm just curious to hearing about what it was like for you to have this process of different ways of exploring these policies, talking to people on the street. I love just hearing that from you. How was that experience for you, just traveling and completely immersing yourself in learning from the people there?
Yeah, it was really honestly such a privilege to
Mhm.
go, everywhere from somewhere like Estonia, where I hadn't been before, and talk to people about things like technology and privacy and computers mostly,
Yeah.
and and then go somewhere like uh, New Zealand and actually spend some time with elder Maori communities and hear about their experiences, and then go somewhere like Norway and hang out at daycare centers and talk to talk to teachers and parents. And it was such an incredibly varied few years that I spent kind of immersing myself as much as possible in these different spaces. And I often felt like I was a real kind of beginner to these spaces, or I was a beginner in these spaces, and I wanted to channel that for my reader. Like I didn't want people to feel like they had to be an expert in using
Mm.
healthcare in order
Mhm.
to really want to fight for universal healthcare. I didn't want them to
Mhm.
feel like
Mhm.
they had to be, school teachers in order to really care about our public school education system. And just in general, and in terms of talking to people, it just it was a really hopeful. I spent 5 years working on this book, and they were 5 years in which the world was going through a lot of really intense things. I started writing the proposal for this book during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and
Mhm.
sitting at home, I again privileged to have a home and to have my health, and still really feeling that anxiety of the changes that the world was going through, the mass death event that we were experiencing as a collective, but also really understanding in that moment the fact that we are all so much more connected than oftentimes we are able to see. And so at the same time that it felt to me more and more clear that we are kind of all in this together, that we have real physical skin in all of these games, let's say, and that we are only, for example, as healthy as our neighbors are.
Mhm.
I was also just so struck by going out into the world and talking to people who were so passionate about the things that they were doing, were so passionate about what their country had done for them, and what they could do for each other. And that was just
Mhm.
again at a time in which many of us were feeling quite a lot of despair. I felt quite a lot of hope by meeting so many people who just really made a difference.
That is so beautiful. We are all in this together. And even just me picturing you being in these spaces and people so willingly sharing about how the policies' effects on them, how to pursue the policies, just that generosity of wanting that to extend beyond themselves just sounds really beautiful and actually really ties into what I'm reminded I was struck by reading the book. And then as you were sharing, which was that we can all share knowledge to uplift everyone, this collectivist notion that you were talking about, and that no sole country has to have all the answers for how their society can thrive. That we can learn from each other across the globe, and that's why it's so beautiful to picture people sharing with you about that. And it's a reminder of the principle that we should learn from each other because nobody is in isolation and no country should be in isolation. And I really appreciated that this book could really be used as proof that it's possible and realistic to implement policies in the United States that would better enable society to thrive. And so for the folks who are like, don't just share the problem, share the solution. Where's the data? Show me the data. This book really tangibly outlines solutions to problems that are backed by data. And at Service Never Sleeps, we don't shy away from the fact that systemic racism is deeply entrenched in many of our problems. Just about all the topics that you highlighted in your book: healthcare, housing, education, environmental justice. And so, if you can just share with us, specifically for our audience, how people can use your book as a resource, specifically to advance racial justice, learning, and action.
Yeah. So I'll talk about racial justice, but just to also say that one of my favorite things that I hear people say, and you've said this as well, is this idea that this book that I wrote that I really am so passionate about is being used physically in the world and that it's being shown to people and that
Yes.
I had a
Oh,
teacher. Thank you so much. I'm really so grateful to all my readers and I've had a couple of experiences where people would come up to me and say, next time I go knocking on doors, I'm going to take your book with me and I'm going to show people the numbers and I'm going to show people what's possible. And another really wonderful experience was someone who told me that they were a teacher in Los Angeles where I finished high school. I went to high school in Mexico as well, as you
mhm,
know. And she was saying to me that she was going to photocopy the Finland chapter and take it with her to bargaining, and that her and her fellow union members were really passionate about what had happened in Finland and could really use some of that inspiration in their actual, very tangible bargaining. So that's I think kind of one of the hopes that I had for this book that
yeah.
has borne out and that I'm just so grateful and thrilled about. And in terms of racial justice, you've already highlighted how these are issues that disproportionately affect
Mhm,
BIPOC communities, and we need to organize around them. Like racism has many faces, and
mhm,
systemic racism, again, as you pointed out, is so deeply embedded in everything from our healthcare access and services to our public schools to
mhm,
our old age finances, as well as broader issues like the climate crisis and who has the ability to afford a safe home and who has the ability to, afford and access to clean drinking water and clean
mhm,
air. And
mhm,
so, my mom's story, going back to her, and again, I'm thinking about her. I have been thinking about her a lot all of these years, but especially now, I think
mhm,
a lot about her. Her story is the story of being an undocumented person in America, but it's
mhm,
also the story of being a woman of color in the US and coming from a Mexican background in the US. But it's also importantly a story about class because we know that class intersects with race in so many ways. And
mhm,
healthcare access in a system that physically privileges the lives of those who have financial means and actively deprioritizes the lives of those who have less or don't have any. And so, again, these are so many issues that are impacting our communities today, but I would argue that a great majority of them also come back to the fact that we live in a deeply unequal society, and it is unequal in so many ways. We're possibly also living in one of the most unequal times in this country's modern history. We just had the world's first trillionaire minted in Elon Musk. Um, and that always kind of reminds me of this core problem that we have in the US, which is that we have these off ramps for the wealthiest Americans. We have
mm,
Elon Musk and others, who have this disproportionate amount of wealth compared to everyone else.
mhm,
You can afford the best healthcare in that the US has to offer. You can afford the best schools, you can for your kids, you can afford the best retirement. And yet the rest of us, despite living in the wealthiest country in the history of the planet, actually have much more limited, if not no access to those same.
Mm,
And so, when I think about how we can think about these issues in terms of racial justice, I really always consider how it's not just our communities, that in some ways our communities are sort of the test case for a lot of these inequalities that I think about how ICE raids were impacting Latinx communities, were impacting even Iranian folks. So I saw both parts of my like heritage really impacted by these ICE raids. And yet we saw, as we saw in Minnesota, that this kind of violence that's being unleashed is not just going to impact one or two communities, that there's
mhm,
that saying of first they came for the
yeah.
socialists and then I did not speak out and because I was not a socialist, and then they came for the unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And we all know how that ends, that then they
Mhm.
came for me and there was no one left to speak out.
Mm,
And so I had this really moving moment not long ago. I was giving a talk at the University of Southern California, and I was talking about my book, and a young Black woman raised her hand and said, you know, in my whole time at university, I think she was a senior, I hadn't seen my experiences reflected in our professors or our speakers' experiences. These kind of issues hadn't been talked about in this way. And I'm so thankful that you've brought these issues up. And in many ways, we'd had very different lives, and yet we had both had family on food stamps. We had both had family that relied on Medicaid. We had both had the experience of not being able to afford to go to the doctor. And that moment of understanding our sort of
mm,
collective strife and realizing that we could fight together to make these issues come to the forefront, that there were so many things that we could organize around, um, that ultimately had the foundation of racial justice. And yet
mhm,
also had this universality to it that I
mhm,
really, I'm a very big believer in universal programs. And
mhm,
part of that is I think that you start your starting point once you have universal access to certain things is so different than when you're still having to fight for communities to have access, for example, to healthcare. Like, I live in the UK and we have universal healthcare, so that means universal access to healthcare. That does not mean there's not racism here. That does not mean
yeah, yeah,
that even within the healthcare system, people aren't having to fight for better healthcare services
mhm,
or more racially aware healthcare
mhm,
services, et cetera. But it does mean that the starting point is already so different that if
mhm,
everyone has access to healthcare, we're fighting for better healthcare outcomes
mhm.
for communities rather than even getting people through the door.
Thank you so much for that. That was really powerful and working backwards. Thank you for lifting up to holding the both end that we can celebrate that countries have implemented certain policies that center people while also holding the fact that that does not exempt them from the continued work, particularly around racism. So that can be a whole thing in itself. So I appreciate you lifting that. And then as you were sharing, especially when you were sharing about that college student that was so beautiful, what was just coming up for me was a term that we use all the time, which is shared humanity, our shared humanity, our shared humanity. And another thing that we talk about all the time, well, we talk about how shared humanity is our goal, and then our specific mission is really building allies to pursue that goal. And I really appreciated as I was reading this and your reminder during this interview that you wrote this so that people didn't feel like they had to be experts to pursue these policies, because that aligns directly with our allyship theme. Allies, it means that you're pursuing justice issues from your positions of privilege. So it means that you certainly don't have all the answers or knowledge about these issues. So there was such a parallel there. And as an organization, we are specifically trying to build allies to pursue racial justice. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for what allies can take away from this book. How can they use their privilege to pursue or advance some of the lessons from this book?
Yeah, and so I would again highlight that, a lot of these issues, a lot of our interests intersect, that a lot of our communities are being impacted by similar things. And so if I take
Mhm,
something, for example, again, like healthcare, and you look at medical debt, it's true that Black Americans have the highest levels of medical debt.
mhm,
And and yet we have 100 million American adults who owe money for healthcare. And so
mhm,
while many millions of those are BIPOC folks, many millions aren't, right? And so this is an issue that we can all get around, that we
mhm,
can, talk about again how it disproportionately impacts our communities, but also how if you're an ally, it also probably impacts your community. And it's
mm,
something that we can organize around together.
mm, mhm,
Again, will have the impact of racial justice, and that, I'm sort of I think I can be very ambitious, hopefully not over ambitious, in thinking that we can fight for all of these things at the same time.
yes.
Um, and again, so I was that's medical debt. There's also the issue of health access in general, of
Mhm,
health insurance coverage. Again,
mm,
um, Hispanic folks, Latina folks have the highest uninsured rates, 18.9, or sorry, 18.4% of people
mm,
of some of my communities as of 2024 are uninsured. 10.1% of Black Americans are uninsured. And then you have things like old age poverty. And we're talking about 15% of older Americans are experiencing poverty. And when we think about sort of just in general our broader society and what that means about the respect that we have for human life, about the respect that we have
mm,
for our elders, for the
mm,
people who gave so much and continue to give so much to our communities, right? Um, if you break it down again, it's like the usual thing, right? Black folks, Latina folks, American Indian folks are all disproportionately represented in old age poverty.
mhm,
And yet,
mhm,
again, this is a problem that impacts all of us too.
mm,
Uh, I could go to homelessness again, and it's the same story over and over again. So
mhm,
I would say that for allies, the importance of highlighting how these issues intersect in all communities and how we can organize around them together, how we can build these coalitions, while also considering how we all have to send our kids to the same schools. We all have to go to the doctor at some point. Uh,
mhm,
and that we are only as healthy as our neighbors are, and we are only
mm.
as healthy as and as vulnerable as the most vulnerable in our societies.
Hmm. Thank you. I'm hearing just always the reminder to hold the both and how do we use the responsibility of our privilege to pursue folks having the same access to thriving that we do, but at the same time, be reminded that we're all connected and that we're all impacted by each other. And so we have a stake in this too, right? This isn't some paternalistic idea of just helping those folks over there. So, really appreciating that reminder. I just have one more question before just opening it up for anything else that you want to make sure you share. And so, the book has been out for a little while now. And if you could go back in time, and give yourself advice at any point in the process, whether it was from research to writing to even once it came out, what advice would that be?
You know, it, I was thinking about so I'm working on my second book now, and I'm looking at city policies. So it's going to be called Another City is Possible. I'm looking at
Wow.
local scale. I'm thinking a lot about how I'm a big city lover. I'm a big city fan. I've lived in cities
Mm,
for most of my life, and
yeah.
in really big cities too. And I have been struck by how some of the same things I learned in the first book, I'm sort of relearning in the second book. And
Mm,
that the biggest lesson seems to come back to community and
mm,
how how we build those communities, how we show up for each other, how we make sure that we don't become isolated, especially in a time in which it's so easy to
Mm,
become isolated online and, and geographically isolated and and a lot of times there are, systemic ways in which we are separated and can't um, see how much we need each other. And so
mhm.
just to, highlight, you asked if there's anything else that I would add, and I thought I could read a little bit from the conclusion of my book, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
So part of the way that I ended this book, a lot of what people would ask me is whether or not, like, what were some of the lessons that I learned from all of the countries I went to? I went to 10 countries.
Hmm.
What could I learn? What were some of the things that were just came out as themes throughout everywhere? And
Hmm.
I have quite a few lessons that I collected in the end, things like we need public ownership, not private profit. This is especially true in healthcare, but in a lot of things. We need to build a society for the many, not the few. We need leaders. We can have it all. These are all, and I go into detail about why I think these things. But one of the things I really highlight often now, especially because of the times we're living in and how difficult it feels, um, to make any sort of progress. Oftentimes, it feels like we're on the defense. We're trying to protect the things that already exist, even in their kind of like civil rights protections that we've had now since that were hard earned since the 1960s, 70s, and onward, and now they're decimated, and we have to defend and try and rebuild those things. But
Hmm.
my number one lesson from all of this, and that I'm relearning now as I go to different cities, is that we can make the best out of the worst of times. So this is lesson
Hmm.
profound societal change is often rooted in moments of deep crisis. In Britain, the National Health Service was born from the blood-stained devastation of World War II. Portugal's radical drug reforms arose from the desperation of dual epidemics unlike any the country had seen. Estonia, Finland, Singapore, and Norway all designed their own policies in the midst of financial crises that required them to reimagine the very foundations of their economies. Faced with environmental devastation, Uruguay and Costa Rica found different but connected ways to tackle the climate and biodiversity crises head on. All of these historically difficult periods had one thing in common. They forced their citizens not just to hope for better, but to work toward better, and they all took it upon themselves to do so. Rather than raise our hands and surrender as we face this avalanche of problems, we must look to the examples in this book and elsewhere and take heart. The lesson is crystal clear. Some of the most effective and longest lasting solutions are forged in the darkest times as we look up from the pits of despair and envision how to get out of the abyss we find ourselves in. More importantly, it's at times like these that we all learn how not to fall back in.
Mm. Whew, what a word. Thank you. I love that closing, even the way you started off by, first of all, letting us know that a new book is coming. And I'm just really moved by the fact that when reading this book, I was so inspired by what other countries are doing. And I there are ways that readers can then feel overwhelmed or almost helpless, like, okay, how am I supposed to influence a whole country? And then so you tying in shared themes from now doing this local research for this new book around community actively pursuing, it feels more tangible, right? It feels like having this posture and this determination needs to start small scale and happen small scale, and we can all do our parts in whatever influence that we have, having these common values to ultimately impact the broader society, the broader country. And so I'm just really appreciating that that was lifted up for me as you were talking about your new book that's coming, but the themes and values remaining the same. And certainly thank you for the reminder that hope may take work, but it has to be the root of the work of knowing that it's possible, no pun intended. So thank you for that passage, just grounding us in hope and the fact that what we're working toward is possible. And we always need to be reminded of that.
Thank you so much, Whitney. Impressed and grateful for how you so gracefully summarize a lot of what what I really like care about. I mean, I think that oftentimes it's not usually people like us who sit in the rooms and talk about policy. And so
Hmm.
I'm glad that we're able to have these kind of conversations and to get to the root of what's important, and which is hope, which is each other, which is,
Yeah.
community, which is not to be too cheesy. And again, I'm in a kind of more emotional state these days.
Sure.
We just love and loving each other. So
Yeah. Yes, love in action is justice work. So thank you so much for that, Natasha. And thank you for the reminder too about how the work also involves talking to each other about these things. And I was reminded when you were talking about how people have leveraged this to go door knocking and influence other people. I sing on my praise and worship team at church, and there are several services. So in between, musicians and singers are in the green room, and I was reading your book, and I remember one of the musicians was like, "What's this about?" So again, I was showing him the table of contents, and he was like, "Ordered." So he ordered it in between services. And this is just a reminder that we need to sync up and debrief this because there's so much power, not just in absorbing this info, but talking about it with each other and how that can inspire the action to move forward. So thank you for reminding me to be accountable to that convo, but also for this beautiful convo with the original source herself of this book. It is truly such an honor.
thank you, Whitney. The honor is mutual, really, truly.
Yeah, is there anywhere or can you share with us where people can get this book and any seeds you want to or hints you want to drop about when and where we'll be able to get your new book as well?
Thanks, Whitney. So this book is available, on bookshop.org or at your local independent bookstore, at a lot of libraries. If it's not available at your library, please request it. They'll be happy to send it over. And at thenewpress.org, which is the publisher, but just really, truly anywhere that you like to buy your books, it's possible to order it, thankfully. And the second book I have to finish it. I have to write it.
Yeah.
But hopefully it'll be out within the next couple of years. And I know that it's a conversation that a lot of us are having right now, as you were pointing out, like where do you start?
Yeah.
Where do you start with the kind of work that can really make an impact on people's daily lives? And I think that as much as I really believe that a lot of these things, for example, need national policies, and I really hope that we can still get there one day. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I also know that, you know, communities and in terms of like the book that I'm looking at, cities are doing such incredible work. And that's true in the US too. I mean,
Yeah.
I often think about this, I still want to write a third book, which is Another America's Possible, and really
Uh-huh.
look
Uh-huh.
at that's being done at home and highlight that as much as we can learn from other countries, which I really think is so important to do, we can also learn from each other at home.
Ah, beautiful. Thank you so much, Natasha. This has been so restoring for me in terms of hope and energy to keep up the important work. So thank you so much for that. And just really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and expertise and experiences with us. It's really an honor to be able to reconnect in adulthood and not only see all the amazing work that you've done, but to be able to learn from it and keep learning as these books keep coming. And so I hope that as many people as possible absorb this as an educational resource as well. And this concludes our book talk conversation. And if you'll humor me, Natasha, I'm going to invite you to participate in a cultural way that we close out any engagement that we do as an organization. So, as some context, we used to do a 72-hour service marathon during Dr. Martin Luther King weekend to show service never sleeping. We don't do that anymore. We rest is resistance. We have learned. And with that context, the year one of my sisters called me about halfway through hour 36, and she was like, "Sissy, are you all right? You must be exhausted." And I was like, "Girl, I am too inspired to be tired." And that's our hashtag now, hashtag too inspired to be tired, because yes, this work is exhausting and and important to take care of ourselves and rest. And at the same time, though, we love that it puts us in spaces with folks like you who give us a renewed sense of energy to continue moving forward. So we always end with people's too inspired to be tired. So either I'm too inspired to be tired because of something from our time together, or I'm too inspired to be tired, so I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. So either I'm too inspired to be tired because, or I'm too inspired to be tired, so I'm going to do. And I can start off with mine as an example, and then I'd love to hand the mic over to you if that's okay.
Of course.
Awesome. I'll say, I am too inspired to be tired. Just thinking back on about a year ago, hearing that you would be doing a book tour right in the city where I live and being able to show up and reconnect after decades of separation to now have this beautiful conversation with each other for so many other people to be inspired by. So I'm just too inspired to be tired by beautiful progression of our relationship over this past year as a result of your beautiful book.
Thank you so much, Whitney. And it's I have a very similar thing in that I'm too inspired to be tired because having this conversation and knowing about the work that you're doing and the work we're all trying to do, I have been reminded that it's urgent, that we've come a really long way, but that the work is as urgent as ever and we have to continue.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Natasha. Another world is possible. Get your copy, friends, and we look forward to the next one when you are ready to share it with us. Until then, friends, be well.